We're joined now by Professor Mary Galvin, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology and Development Studies at the University of Johannesburg. A very good evening to you, Professor. Thank you so much for speaking to us. To your mind, what is at the center of the ongoing water supply shortages?
Thank you. I guess I would start with a common thing where they're saying that it's our demand, it's the population growth, it's the climate, it's water scarcity. We know all those things are true, but this is causing us to look more deeply at systems failure, at a question of whether we know the infrastructure, the maintenance, the finance, the lack of skills are having a deep impact on the system, and that altogether it ends up being a problem of governance that is behind the actual lack of water.
Okay, so perhaps let's just start with what may appear to be the more readily understandable, and then we'll drill down to the more complex systemic problems, high temperatures, as you mentioned, climatic conditions, and at the moment, we know that South Africa is experiencing widespread load shedding. Just please talk to us about how this is putting pressure on the water systems.
The entire process in a big city of providing water is based and driven on electrical availability, the ability to pump the water, to monitor the levels of the reservoirs, to treat the water. These all require electricity. And even when there is sort of an exemption of certain facilities, that they are not impacted by load shedding has other spin-on mechanical effects on that whole system. So it's all interwoven, and when we do have load shedding, then we don't have the reservoirs filling so that people can access the water, especially high-lying areas.
And just in terms of, we're talking obviously about Gauteng at this point, the major suppliers in terms of the bulk water supplier, Rand Water, for instance, it's also spoken about serious temperatures being of concern. But I just want to understand how the system, the network works, and how is it possible if one of the major water treatment plants is not working, if it's not possible to rely on another?
The wastewater treatment plants are a problem. I just want to put it in context. The wastewater treatment plants are problems throughout the country. We've been highlighting the crisis with wastewater treatment for, as long as I can remember, for the last years at least. And those treatment plants don't have skilled people, haven't been maintained, and are failing us. So in a sense, what we're starting to see in big cities is we've had this long lead up. That's not just a load shedding issue. That's an institutional issue, a lack of finance and skills to maintain those things.
And you mentioned there's also a lack of capacity in terms of qualified staff. What are the major problems there?
I think that we're not training enough people as engineers able to run this. Then secondly, we're also aware of the hiring procedures and problems and nepotism and those sorts of crises. I guess thirdly, the amount of finance that's put toward maintaining various systems, including wastewater treatment. And frankly, I always think, what do you actually get when you have these skills of working for sort of a failing system? Wouldn't you prefer to go take a nice job in the private sector? You have to be very committed to be working in that field.
Yesterday, a few of our colleagues did quite a few in-depth stories about the sanitation reticulation systems, particularly in the Eastern Cape, and I think what was in the Northwest. I believe this might be deemed a problem in Gauteng as well, but I believe that's an area you don't really want to speak too much on. But I'm wondering what people can do in the meantime to mitigate the impact of these water interruptions. And in some cases, there is no water supply for 2 days, we understand.
Yes, I mean, elsewhere in the country, people have unfortunately become, we know about Cape Town, but in the Eastern Cape, people have become more used to dealing with these issues, usually by storing water is probably the number one way, that when water is flowing, there are big tanks or multiple containers where people are storing as much as they can, so when there's water, they have water to draw from.
Is there a way, I mean, I was just thinking about the irony of this. If we talk about the climatic challenges, so we have KwaZulu-Natal, which is experiencing heavy rains or flooding in some areas, and then we then are confronted with, lack of water supply. Is there no catchment areas? Are there no ways to use the one challenge to solve the other?
The catchment areas. I think that the whole water scarcity, I mean, South Africa can be a water scarce country. We have level 1 sort of regulations about not watering your plants and all of this. We're familiar with that. But the National Water Act allocates water for people first. That's the first responsibility of water, of WSAs, of municipality, is people. But that's not happening. So for me, it keeps going back to a governance failure of what are these municipalities actually doing to make sure that people have water. And the actor that no one's speaking about is the Department of Water and Sanitation, which is meant to be regulating this and asking what is going on and intervening. There is a lot of allowance in legislation, even in the Constitution, for an intervention when a municipality isn't delivering. Government in Gauteng's not delivering. What is anyone going to do about it?
So for the ordinary citizens, obviously there have been water restrictions that have either applied or appeal for self-regulation of sorts, and either, whether it's watering your garden, washing your car, or, filling up your pool. But what can we do day to day to help save water as best as we possibly can so that everyone gets their fair share of their basic needs?
I think there's a big role for citizens in this, and this is where we need to look to people who have been struggling for water for a long time, and that's mostly happening with the poor population. In the city of Cape Town, when there were water regulations put in place and rationing of water, the amount that was set was more than a free basic amount, more than people had in townships, ironically. So here you had a middle class upset that it had to conserve water, but it was still getting more water than most people in the country. So how do you conserve water? I think we need to look to people who've been living on very little water for a long time. You don't turn on a tap and brush your teeth. You don't fill your swimming pool. You try to capture as much rainwater as you can. There are numerous small things that one can do. But for me, there are two things, and one is dealing with expectations of our government. We need to be able to make demands, but at the moment we can expect very little. So the sooner we can stop, we can shift to adjusting our expectations, not because we should, but because we have to, and living within a smaller amount. That needs to go hand in hand with strong citizen action to hold our government accountable and to demand the sort of water integrity that we need. That's not just about getting rid of corruption, but also about participating and that holding accountable. So I've been very heartened to see growing middle class action. I know the area I live, there's a new water crisis committee of middle class people saying this isn't okay. So maybe those actions now join forces with protests that have been happening around service delivery throughout the country for many years, and those join forces to try to, across the board, make a demand on our government to pay attention not just to infrastructural failure, but to governance failures.
Professor Mary Galvin, thank you so much for your time. She's an associate professor at the Department of Anthropology and Development Studies at the University of Johannesburg.